Are you hurt?
I'm okay. I got it out in time. It's okay.
You're not okay. You're shaking. Where is the guard? Who pulled the guard off this line?
We had a pilot efficiency run scheduled for this station. I signed off on it myself.
You signed off on running my daughter's hand through an unguarded intake.
Nobody was supposed to be working this station today. There was a scheduling mix-up.
She's been on this line every Tuesday for 6 weeks, Garrett.
That's not a mix-up. That's you not checking. What is this?
That's not what it looks like. It's got your name on it, a job title, and the words upon ratification, Garrett. Tell me what else it's supposed to look like.
Around them, a dozen sorters had stopped working entirely, the belt still ticking as it cooled, every one of them watching. The man who'd nearly let a 16-year-old lose her hand explained himself to the man who'd nearly caused it. "We'll talk about this later," Landry said, low now, glancing at the crowd. "Somewhere that isn't the floor." "We'll talk about it right here," Holden said, "in front of every person whose contract you're about to sell out from under them." A floor supervisor named Odell Trask, a broad, quiet man who rarely spoke up in front of management, stepped out from behind the baler with his phone already raised, recording. "I've got the whole thing, Holden, timestamp and all." Landry's eyes cut to the phone and back. "That's not necessary, Odell." "Feels pretty necessary to me," Odell said, not lowering it, "given what almost just happened to a 16-year-old on my watch." Tessa flexed her fingers slowly, testing them, still catching her breath. "The guard bolts were gone, Dad, not loose. Gone. Somebody unscrewed all 4 of them." Holden crouched at the base of the intake, running his thumb along the empty bolt holes where the guard should have been seated. 4 clean threaded sockets with nothing in them, no washers, no shavings, no sign of a rushed or accidental removal. "This wasn't a mix-up, Garrett. Mix-ups don't remove 4 bolts clean and set them somewhere. Where are the bolts?" Landry didn't answer that. He gathered the last of his scattered papers off the concrete, tucked the torn page back into the folder with visible effort to look unbothered, and walked toward the office trailer without looking back, leaving the question sitting in the air over the cooling belt for everyone on the floor to hear unanswered. Holden Doran was 46 years old, and he had spent 19 years working the sanitation routes and sorting floors of Bramwell Waste and Recycling before the men and women on those routes elected him local union president, a vote he still considered the proudest thing he'd ever earned with his hands instead of his mouth. He'd been divorced 3 years, his ex-wife remarried and settled 2 states away, and he raised his daughter Tessa mostly alone. A fact the plant's regional management liked to bring up whenever they wanted to suggest, gently and repeatedly, that a man with that much on his plate might be better suited to a quieter role than union president. Tessa was 16, sharp-tongued and stubborn about fairness in the specific way of teenagers who have decided the adult world runs on rules it refuses to actually follow. And she had taken the summer sorting job over Holden's mild objections, insisting she wanted to earn it like everyone else on the floor rather than be handed something easier because of who her father was. She had never once asked for special treatment. The irony of nearly losing a hand on the one line where nobody had bothered to check on her at all was not lost on either of them. Garrett Landry had been Holden's hand-picked recommendation for vice president 6 years earlier, a quieter, sharper-dressed man Holden had personally trained in grievance procedure and contract law because he'd believed back then that Landry actually cared about the same things he did. Holden's ex-wife had left 3 years ago for a job offer in another state, a decision Holden had never once tried to talk her out of, because the marriage had been quietly over long before the job offer gave either of them a clean reason to admit it. Tessa had chosen to stay with him without much discussion, a decision that had surprised exactly no one who'd watched the 2 of them work through a broken dishwasher or a flat tire together over the years, father and daughter operating less like parent and child and more like 2 people who simply trusted each other's judgment. Regional management had never quite known what to do with a union president raising a teenager alone, and their discomfort tended to surface as concern, always phrased gently, always suggesting Holden might want to consider stepping back from the demands of leadership for his daughter's sake, a suggestion Holden recognized for what it was and declined every single time. The executive board called an emergency session 2 days later, and Holden walked in expecting to talk about the guard and the letter. Instead, the board chair slid a printed statement across the table before Holden had even taken his coat off. There's an allegation on the table, the chair said, not meeting his eyes. Anonymous tip to the international office, backed up by bank records. It says you've been drawing a second paycheck out of the local's dues account under a no-show position paid out to your daughter. Holden read the printout twice before the words rearranged into something he could actually process. A payroll ledger, his own local's letterhead, Tessa's name listed under a job title, administrative support, a position that had never existed, drawing $400 a week for the last 11 months. I've never seen this document in my life, Holden said. My daughter works the sorting floor. She clocks in with a badge like everyone else. She's never touched a dime of union dues money. The bank records show deposits into an account with her name on it. Then somebody opened an account in her name or doctored the records. Because I promise you on everything I have that money never came from us. He looked around the table at faces he'd known for years, some of them avoiding his eyes entirely. Garrett, you're the one who handles the locals' books day to day. Did you flag this? I forwarded it the moment it crossed my desk, Landry said, smooth, almost sorrowful. I didn't want to believe it either, Holden. I still don't, honestly. But the board has to take it seriously, given the source. Given the source you won't name. That's not how anonymous tips work, and you know that better than anyone, given how many grievances you've filed off the back of them yourself. The board voted to suspend him pending investigation 4-2, the two dissenting votes, both men who'd worked routes with Holden for over a decade. Landry would serve as acting president in the interim, a phrase the chair read off a printed motion. Holden would later learn Landry had drafted himself 2 days before the vote even happened. One of the two dissenting votes, a route driver named Odell's cousin Cassius Marsh, who'd known Holden since they were both 22 years old loading the same truck, caught him in the parking lot afterward. This doesn't sit right, Holden. 11 months of a fake paycheck and nobody in payroll flags it until 2 days after you catch Garrett red-handed on the sorting floor? That's not an investigation. That's a stall tactic wearing a suit. I know how it looks. I don't think you do, Cassius said. I think you're too busy being angry to notice it's convenient. You want my advice? Keep your head down exactly as long as it takes to build something nobody can talk their way around. Garrett's good with a room. He is not good with paper. Holden turned the words over more than once in the days that followed, the way a man turns over the one piece of advice that actually fits the shape of his situation instead of just sounding wise in the moment. Holden drove home that night without turning on the radio, replaying every version of the conversation where he should have pushed harder, said something sharper, and arrived at his own driveway no closer to an answer than when he'd left. Tessa was waiting on the porch steps, still in her work clothes, having heard the broad strokes of it from a co-worker's group chat before her father had even gotten the chance to tell her himself. They think you stole money and gave it to me, she said, flat, testing the shape of the accusation out loud like she couldn't quite believe it fit. That's insane. I have a real badge. I clock in every single day. I know. We're going to prove that. He sat down beside her on the steps, the porch light drawing moths in slow circles above them. I need you to understand something, though. Whoever built this wasn't guessing. They used your actual name, your actual social security number, probably, to open something that looks real enough to fool people who've known me for years. That takes access. That takes planning. Garrett, Tessa said, not a question. I don't know yet. I intend to find out. The rumor made it to her coworkers faster than either of them expected, the way anything embarrassing tends to travel through a workplace of 200 people who all know each other's shift schedules. A few of the younger sorters started going quiet whenever she walked past the break room, and one, a classmate she'd known since middle school, asked her outright if it was true that her dad had been stealing from the union to pay her allowance. Tessa didn't cry about it in front of Holden, not once, but he found her sitting on the back steps one evening, scrubbing at her eyes with the heel of her hand. Anyway, and she didn't bother pretending otherwise when he sat down beside her. I keep thinking if I just work harder, clock in earlier, do everything exactly right, people will stop looking at me like that, she said. But it doesn't matter how right I do it. They already decided what they think happened. They'll know the truth soon enough, Holden said. And for what it's worth, the ones who matter already do. Odell didn't need convincing. Cassius didn't either. I know. She wiped her face once more, done with it. I just hate that somebody got to decide what people think about me without ever asking me anything first. That's exactly what we're going to take back from him, Holden said. Every bit of it. He found the local's assigned labor attorney the next morning, a sharp, unhurried woman named Marla Ostro, who worked out of a modest office 2 towns over and represented 3 other locals besides his own. She read through the payroll printout and the bank statement once, set them both down, and uncapped a red pen underlining a single date at the top of the account opening page and nothing else on either document. "This is sloppier than it looks at first glance," Marla told him. "A no-show job that specific, drawing that exact amount weekly for exactly 11 months, dressed up to look routine enough that nobody checks it. That's not the work of someone panicking. That's someone who's done this kind of thing before, or someone who had a lot of quiet time to plan it." She tapped the red line under the date. "This is 11 months old, Holden. Whatever's happening with the contract right now didn't start this month. It's been building for almost a year." Marla's office smelled faintly of the coffee she kept burning on a hot plate in the corner, and stacks of case files climbed one wall, each one marked along the spine with a single strip of colored tape. Red for evidence she'd stake her license on, yellow for anything that still needed corroborating. Nothing else, no folded corners, no scrawled margin notes. Holden asked her about it once, and she told him plainly that a file marked up everywhere stopped telling you anything useful. One red line in the right place was worth more than a page covered in ink. "You're on record until the board clears me," Holden said. "I can't act like I'm building a case against Garrett. Every move I make gets reported back." "Then don't act like you're building one," Marla said. "Act exactly like a man cooperating fully with his own investigation right up until the moment you're not." That night, Holden called Cassius more to hear another voice in the house than because he expected an answer, and learned the man had already spent the evening asking around quietly among drivers who ran routes past 2 other regional locals without naming Landry outright whether anyone had ever heard of a vice president negotiating himself into a management job in the middle of a contract fight. "It happens more than you'd think," Cassius said, "and it almost never gets caught in time because nobody wants to believe it about a man they trained themselves. You catch it early, or you don't catch it at all. Sounds like you're catching it early. Don't let anybody talk you into slowing down out of politeness." He hung up and sat in his kitchen a long while after that, Tessa already asleep down the hall, turning Cassius's words over against every year he'd spent teaching Garrett Landry how to read a contract clause, wondering how many of those lessons Landry had quietly repurposed against him. The first real break came from a man nobody on the executive board had thought to ask anything at all. Cyrus Whitlow had worked the sorting floor for 33 years, long enough to be considered furniture by most of management. The kind of veteran younger supervisors rolled their eyes at in meetings and stopped listening to halfway through his first sentence. Cyrus had a habit, going back decades, of writing down every safety incident he witnessed in a series of black composition notebooks he kept in a lockbox at home. A habit that had started the year a coworker lost 2 fingers to a baler. Nobody had properly inspected, and the company's official report blamed the man's own carelessness. He found Holden in the break room 2 days after the suspension, sliding into the seat across from him without being invited, 3 notebooks stacked in front of him like evidence he'd been waiting years to finally use. "I heard what they're saying about you," Cyrus said. "I don't believe a word of it, and I want you to see something before you go fighting this blind." He opened the oldest notebook to a page dated 9 years back, then another from 6 years back, then one from just 18 months ago. Each entry describing the same pattern in different words: a safety guard or protocol quietly suspended for a pilot or efficiency trial, always in the weeks leading up to a contract negotiation, always followed within a month by an injury serious enough to require medical leave, always settled fast and quiet with a payout and a signed confidentiality agreement before the union rank and file ever heard the details. 3 times before this one, Cyrus said. 3 separate contract cycles, 3 convenient accidents, 3 workers who took a settlement and never talked about it again because the settlement money was more than any of us make in 2 years combined. I always figured it was a company pattern. Looking at the dates now, next to when Garrett Landry came onto the executive board, I don't think it's the company running this anymore. I think it's him. Why didn't you say something before now? Would you have believed a man everybody already calls senile behind his back? Cyrus's voice didn't carry any self-pity in it, just a flat, tired accuracy. I kept the notebooks anyway, figured someday somebody would need them who'd actually listen. Cyrus still had a phone number for the man from the oldest entry, and Holden drove out to see him that same weekend, uninvited, half expecting a door shut in his face. Bernard Aldous answered anyway, a heavy-set man in his 60s now, missing the middle and ring fingers on his right hand, and he didn't seem surprised to see a Union president standing on his porch 9 years after the fact. "I wondered when somebody would finally come ask," Bernard said, not unkindly, waving Holden in. "Cyrus still keeping those notebooks?" "Hi is." "Good, I burned mine, wasn't proud of that, but the settlement had a clause about discussing the incident publicly, and I had a mortgage and 3 kids and a hand that wasn't going to grow its fingers back no matter how loud I got about it." He held up the hand without any drama, just a fact he'd made peace with a long time ago. "They called it a pilot program too back then. Different name for the same thing you're describing. Guard came off the bailer 2 weeks before a contract vote. Company said it was a maintenance oversight, and I signed papers agreeing never to say otherwise in exchange for enough money to keep the house. Did you ever find out who ordered the guard removed? Never had the resources to find out. Didn't have a Cyrus with notebooks going back that far. Didn't have a lawyer who wasn't already the company's lawyer, and didn't have anybody in leadership willing to ask twice." Bernard looked at his own hand again, turning it over. "You've got all 3 now, from what Cyrus tells me. Do something with it. I'm not looking for an apology 9 years late. I'm looking for it to actually stop happening to the next man." Holden left with Bernard's number, his blessing to use his name if it came to that, and a 4th data point Marla would later fold into her filing chronology. Proof the pattern reached back further than even Cyrus's earliest notebook, further than Landry's tenure on the board, evidence that the scheme he'd inherited or invented had roots the company itself had been quietly protecting for the better part of 2 decades. Marla, when Holden brought her the notebooks, spent an entire evening cross-referencing dates against public corporate filings before she found the thread that turned the whole shape of it. A consulting entity called Praxis Field Advisory, registered 8 years ago, had been paid by Bramwell's parent company for labor strategy consulting on an irregular but recurring basis, always in months that lined up with contract negotiations. The registered owner of Praxis Field Advisory, buried 3 layers down in a state filing database, was Dalton Cade, Bramwell's regional operations director, the same man who would be signing off on Garrett Landry's promised director title. The payment history told its own smaller story inside the larger one. The earliest disbursements, going back the full 8 years, were routed to a name Marla didn't recognize at all, someone who'd apparently left the company long before Holden ever knew to look. Landry's name didn't attach to a single payment until 6 years back, the same year he'd taken the vice president's seat, which told Marla plainly enough that Cade hadn't built this arrangement around Landry specifically. He'd simply needed a new man in the right chair when the old one moved on, and Landry had been standing there. "Landry's not just getting a job offer," Marla told Holden, laying the filing out on her desk. "He's been getting paid consulting fees for years, routed through a shell company owned by the same executive who's about to reward him with a real title. This isn't a bribe that started with your daughter's frame job. That was just the most recent tool. This is a partnership that's been running quietly for the better part of a decade. If someone you trust starts building a paper trail against you using the people you love most," Marla added, closing the folder, "that isn't a single bad decision anymore, Holden. That's a man who's been planning his exit for years and finally found the last piece he needed to force it through." Holden sat with that for a long moment, thinking of every contract cycle he'd fought through beside Garrett Landry, every late night strategizing grievances together, every one of those years apparently running alongside a second, quieter negotiation he'd never once been told about. Cassius, who'd sat across from Landry at more strategy sessions over the years than almost anyone, besides Holden himself, filled in the last piece of the man's motive a few days later over coffee. It wasn't money that had eaten at Garrett Landry, Cassius said, not first anyway. The man had never once complained about his paycheck in 6 years. What ate at him was watching every contract win, every grievance he'd drafted line by line at 2 a.m, get read out to the membership under Holden's name at the podium instead of his own, year after year, until a title that was actually his, printed on real letterhead with nobody else's name above it, had stopped feeling like something he might someday earn and started feeling like something he was owed and being denied. Doesn't excuse a thing he did, Cassius said. But I don't think Cade bought Garrett with money, not at first. I think Cade just noticed a man who'd spent 6 years standing in somebody else's shadow and offered to put his name in the light instead. The money only started mattering to Garrett after he'd already decided he wanted the rest of it. You've known him a long time too, Holden said. Longer than most on the floor. Did you ever see this coming? Not the shape of it, no. But I remember him going quiet every year right after contract ratification, right when the membership thanked you by name and never thought to thank him too. I figured it was just how some men are. Turns out it was something he'd been keeping a tally of the whole time, and none of us thought to ask which. Holden didn't feel much sympathy for it, not with Tessa's real name sitting inside a fabricated payroll record, but he understood hearing it that Landry hadn't stumbled into this by accident. He'd built it slowly out of a resentment nobody at the local had ever thought to ask him about, and that made the 8 years of quiet planning feel less like a mystery and more like a grudge finally coming due in the worst possible way. The exact mechanics of the frame-up took another few days to surface, and when they did, the specificity of it turned Holden's stomach in a way the vague accusation hadn't managed. Landry, as vice president, had legitimate access to the local's payroll system for dues deduction reconciliation, a routine part of his job that nobody had ever thought to audit closely. Marla's forensic review of the account showed that Tessa's real employment record, her actual badge number and actual hire date from the sorting floor, had been duplicated into a second near-identical entry with one digit changed in the position code. Just different enough to route her real information into a fake job title without tripping any basic cross-check. It wasn't an invented person. It was Holden's actual daughter, her actual real employment, quietly forked into two versions so the fraud would survive a surface-level glance from anyone who bothered to look her up. That's the part that should scare people most when this comes out, Marla said. It would have been easier for him to invent a fake name entirely. He didn't. He built it around a real 16-year-old with a real badge because a real person is harder to disprove quickly, and he was counting on nobody looking past the first layer. Cyrus wanted to bring his notebook straight to the full executive board, and he got his chance sooner than expected when Landry, informed that Cyrus had been meeting with Holden, called a special session and put unreliable rumors circulating on the floor on the agenda himself, a preemptive strike dressed up as due diligence. I've heard Cyrus Whitlow's been telling stories again, Landry said, not quite looking at the old man seated near the back of the room. I have a lot of respect for Cyrus's years of service, genuinely, but we all know memory isn't always what it used to be after 3 decades on a sorting floor, and I'd hate for the board to make a serious decision based on an old man's half-remembered version of events from a lifetime ago. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when everyone recognizes cruelty dressed up as concern. Cyrus didn't raise his voice. My memory's fine, Garrett. Fine enough that I remember training you on grievance filing your first year here back when you used to ask me questions instead of talking over me in front of a room. He set one of the notebooks on the table, closed, not yet opened. I'll let the dates speak for themselves when the time comes. I'm not in any hurry. I've had these dates written down a lot longer than you've had that job offer sitting in your desk drawer. Landry's jaw tightened just enough for Holden, watching from the back where suspended officers were required to sit to see it land. 2 board members who'd voted for the suspension exchanged a look across the table, the kind of look that meant a private conversation was already forming in their heads about whether they'd voted too fast. Neither said anything out loud yet, not with Landry still running the meeting, but Holden caught it, filed it away the same careful way Marla filed dates against public records, and understood that the board's confidence in Landry had just quietly started to crack, even if the vote count in the room hadn't moved an inch. Afterward, in the parking lot, one of them, a soft-spoken forklift operator named Regina Falk, who rarely spoke up in meetings at all, caught Holden by his truck. I voted to suspend you, she said, not quite an apology yet. I want you to know I've been rereading that payroll printout every night since, and it doesn't sit right anymore. Something about how clean it looked. Real fraud is usually messier than that. It was clean because he had 11 months to make it clean, Holden said. You're not wrong to have voted the way the evidence pointed at the time. I just need the board to keep looking at the rest of it with the same care you're giving it right now. I intend to, Regina said, and meant it. The ratification vote was set for 13 days out, a date Landry had pushed through the board on the argument that the company's offer had a hard deadline attached, and Holden understood, sitting in that back row with his suspension still active, that 13 days was not very much time to undo 8 years of quiet groundwork. "We have 3 separate threads," Marla told him and Cyrus, laying them across her desk like a hand of cards. The safety pattern from Cyrus's notebooks, the Praxis Field advisory payments, and the fraud on Tessa's employment record. Individually, any one of these is embarrassing for Landry. Together, in front of the full membership right before a vote, they're disqualifying. The problem is timing. Your suspension doesn't lift until the board formally clears you, and the board is currently run by the man we're trying to expose. "Then we don't wait on the board," Holden said. "The local's bylaws let any member in good standing address the floor at a general meeting with or without holding office. I've read those bylaws more times than Garrett ever cared to." "That still leaves the meeting itself as his to control," Marla said. "He sets the agenda. He can refuse to recognize you, have you removed for disorderly conduct, adjourn early. He controls the room until the moment he doesn't." It was Tessa who noticed the next irregularity, working her regular Tuesday shift despite Holden's half-hearted attempt to have her take the summer off entirely, an offer she'd flatly refused. A cluster of unfamiliar faces had started showing up on the floor that week, introduced by a supervisor as temporary seasonal support. Badges printed in a batch that didn't match the usual onboarding paperwork timeline. Tessa mentioned it to her father almost as an afterthought over dinner, and Holden went very still. "How many?" he asked. "Maybe 20. They're not doing much, mostly just standing around near the break room during shift changes." She frowned, replaying it. "One of them asked me where the meeting hall was going to be Thursday. Weird question for someone who's only been here a week." Marla confirmed it within a day. 22 temporary staffing agency workers, hired on short-term contracts through a third-party agency, none of them meeting the 90-day minimum employment threshold the local zone bylaws required for voting eligibility. If they showed up at the ratification meeting and were allowed to cast ballots anyway in a vote expected to be close, 22 illegitimate votes could be more than enough to tip it. "He's not just trying to control the meeting," Marla said. "He's trying to control the count." Landry found Holden alone in the parking lot 2 nights before the vote, the first time the 2 men had spoken without a table and a board between them since the day of the accident. He kept his distance, hands in his coat pockets, his voice pitched somewhere between reasonable and warning. "You could still walk away from this clean, Holden. Board clears you, you finish out your term with some dignity. Nobody has to drag your daughter's name through a hearing room." He let that sit a beat. "I trained under you for 6 years. I know exactly how far you're willing to push something once you decide it's a fight worth having. I'd hate to watch you push this one all the way to the bottom. You said her name like it's a favor you're doing me, not keeping it out of a hearing room. I'm saying there's still a version of this where everyone keeps what they've got." "There isn't," Holden said. "Not for you. You made sure of that the day you built a fake job around a real 16-year-old instead of just lying to my face like a normal man would have. I could have forgiven a lie, Garrett. I'm not going to forgive that." Landry didn't have an answer for that one, and for the first time since the emergency board session, Holden watched something like doubt move across his face before he turned and walked back toward his car without another word. Holden spent the next several nights building a folder of his own, copies of everything, 3 sets each, one for himself, one for Marla, one sealed and left with Cassius Marsh, a coworker he trusted who had no formal role in any of it, insurance against anything happening to the other 2. Cassius took the sealed folder without asking what was in it, just tucked it into the glove box of his route truck and told Holden it would stay there, untouched, until somebody who actually needed it came asking. "You really think Garrett would try something that far, going after the folders themselves?" Cassius asked. "I think a man who spent 8 years hiding a shell company doesn't stop covering his tracks just because he got caught once," Holden said. "I'd rather have 3 copies sitting in 3 places nobody would think to look than 1 copy sitting somewhere convenient." He briefed Cyrus on exactly what to say and when, rehearsed the bylaw language on standing recognition until he could recite it without notes, walked Marla through every worst-case version of how Landry might try to shut the meeting down early, and made himself one promise he repeated to Tessa the night before the meeting, sitting at the same kitchen table where she'd first told him about the fake job title. "Whatever happens in that hall tomorrow," he told her, "I need you to know none of it changes what actually happened on that sorting floor. You don't have to speak if you don't want to. Nobody's asking that of you. I want to, Tessa said, and there was nothing shaking in her voice at all. Only the same flat, stubborn fairness she'd carried onto the floor every Tuesday since June. It happened to my hand, Dad. I get to say so. Regina Falk called that same night, offering, unprompted, to second any motion Holden or Cyrus put forward from the floor. A small procedural detail that mattered more than it sounded like it should, since a motion without a second never even reached a vote. Odell texted a copy of his original sorting floor recording to 3 separate personal accounts. His own quiet insurance against anyone trying to claim the footage had gone missing overnight. Bernard Aldous, when Holden called to let him know the meeting was finally set, said only that he'd be watching from home with the television off and the phone charged in case anybody needed to hear from him too. By the time Holden turned off the kitchen light that night, he understood, in a way he hadn't quite let himself believe 2 weeks earlier, that he wasn't walking into that hall carrying this alone. The Union Hall was standing room only by the time the meeting opened. Folding chairs packed 12 rows deep, the 22 unfamiliar badges clustered near the side exit exactly where Tessa had described them. Landry ran the agenda from the front table with practice calm, moved through old business fast, and reached the contract ratification item with the confident rhythm of a man who had counted his votes twice already. Given the pending investigation into former President Doran's conduct, Landry said, he does not currently hold standing to address this floor in an official capacity. I'm not asking to speak as president. Holden stood from the third row, voice carrying without needing to shout. I'm a dues-paying member in good standing. Article 6, Section 2 of this local's bylaws guarantees any member the floor on a matter directly before a vote. I've got the language memorized, Garrett, same as you do. This meeting doesn't have time for procedural theater. Then have security handle it, Landry said, and 2 men in unmarked jackets Holden had never seen at a single prior meeting moved toward the aisle, hands already reaching for his arm. Odell Trask stood up from the 4th row before either of the unmarked men reached Holden, phone already raised again, the same recording habit that had caught the empty bolt holes on the sorting floor months earlier. Somebody want to explain who signs these 2 men's checks? Because it isn't this local, and I've been treasurer's assistant long enough to know every face on our payroll. Neither man answered. Neither man moved any closer either. The hall erupted into noise, chairs scraping, a dozen members on their feet at once, and it was Cyrus Whitlow who cut through it, rising slowly from his seat near the back with a black composition notebook already open in his hand. Article 6, Section 2 applies to me too, Garrett, and I've been a member in good standing 33 years longer than you've been alive at this company. His voice didn't need to be loud to carry. The room had already gone quiet to hear it. You can drag Holden Doran out of this hall. You cannot drag out everything I've written down since the year Bernard Aldous lost 2 fingers to a baler this company said was his own fault. He read the dates. He read the pattern, 3 prior contract cycles, 3 convenient accidents, 3 settlements bought with silence. And by the 3rd date, the security men had stopped moving entirely, uncertain now whose instructions actually carried weight in the room. Marla stood next, laying out the Praxis Field advisory filings on the overhead projector Landry had set up for his own presentation, Dalton Cade's name highlighted in the registration documents for every member in the hall to read for themselves. Then she turned to the payroll fraud, the duplicated employment record, the real badge number forked into a fake job title, and asked, without raising her voice at all, whether the acting president would care to explain it to the one person in the room it actually belonged to. Tessa stood up from beside her father's empty seat, 16 years old in a hall full of grown adults, twice her age, and did not wait to be recognized. That's my real job, she said. I clock in every Tuesday. I've never taken a dollar that wasn't my actual paycheck. And 3 weeks ago, my hand was an inch from an intake roller because somebody pulled a safety guard off my line without telling anyone, and that same somebody is standing up there right now telling you all to trust him with your contract. Cassius Marsh stood next, still in his route uniform, and moved that the floor be open to any member who wished to speak before the vote, a motion that passed by voice acclamation loud enough to rattle the folding chairs. One by one, sorters and route drivers. Holden had worked beside for years, stood to say their piece, brief and unpolished. A longtime sorter who'd trained under Bernard Aldous before his accident and remembered exactly which supervisor had signed off on removing his guard. a young driver who'd clocked the 22 unfamiliar badges arriving that same week and thought nothing of it until now. Odell reading off the timestamp on his own recording from the sorting floor for anyone who still wanted to hear Landry's voice admit to signing off on the pilot run himself. Landry stood at the front table through all of it, saying nothing, his composure sliding by degrees with every new voice that stood up. The vote to table the ratification and remove Garrett Landry from office by emergency motion carried within the hour, the 22 ineligible badges quietly stripped from the tally once the sergeant-at-arms cross-checked employment dates against the bylaws Holden had spent 13 days memorizing. Landry left through the side exit alone, past the same unmarked security men who no longer had anyone paying them to stay. The hall didn't empty out right away. Members lingered in clusters for the better part of an hour, some shaking Holden's hand, some simply standing near Tessa telling her, in the plain, unpolished way of people who work with their hands for a living, that they were sorry nobody had caught it sooner and glad she'd been the one brave enough to stand up and say so herself. Cyrus sat alone near the back for a while afterward, his 3 notebooks stacked in front of him, and when Holden came to sit beside him, the old man only shook his head slowly. 33 years I carried those around figuring nobody would ever want to hear it, Cyrus said. Feels strange having it matter. It always mattered, Holden told him. It just needed somebody willing to listen all the way to the end. Odell found them both a few minutes later, still holding his phone, and admitted a little sheepishly that he'd been uploading the footage to a shared drive in real time the entire meeting. Insurance in case anyone tried to claim later that the vote hadn't been conducted fairly. Nobody ever did. The International Union's Ethics Committee opened a formal expulsion proceeding within the week, and federal labor investigators followed close behind once Marla forwarded the Praxis Field advisory filings to the Department of Labor's racketeering division. Garrett Landry was charged with violating federal labor law protections against employer payments to union officials, along with wire fraud tied to the falsified payroll records. Dalton Cade's role surfaced fast once investigators started pulling Bramwell's own internal communications, and the company's parent corporation, eager to distance itself before the story reached local news, placed him on leave within days and opened its own internal review. Dalton Cade resigned from Bramwell's parent corporation before the internal review even concluded. A resignation the company's press office described only as mutual and amicable language nobody who'd sat in that union hall found remotely convincing. Regina Falk, still on the executive board, moved that the local formally request its own copy of the internal review findings once federal investigators cleared it for release, a motion that passed without a single dissenting vote. The board reinstated Holden as president unanimously at the next scheduled meeting, the same 4 votes that had suspended him now voting the other direction without a word of apology. Any of them seemed able to fine, though 2 of them shook his hand afterward and held on a beat longer than a handshake usually required. Holden didn't need the apology. He needed the floor back, and he got it. The contract itself went back to the negotiating table entirely, this time with Cyrus Whitlow appointed to the safety subcommittee at Holden's insistence. His 33 years of notebooks finally treated as the resource they'd always been instead of an old man's habit nobody wanted to hear about. Regina Falk joined the same subcommittee at her own request, telling Holden plainly that she intended to spend the rest of her time on the board making sure no future accusation against anyone ever moved as fast or as quietly as the one against him had. The final agreement restored every safety guard removed under the so-called pilot programs, added an independent third-party inspection clause the company couldn't quietly waive again, and included language, drafted personally by Marla, requiring any officer compensation tied to company-affiliated entities to be disclosed to the full membership before any vote. Holden drove out to see Bernard Aldous again once the new contract language was finalized, bringing a copy of the Safety Subcommittee's inspection clause for the older man to read for himself. Bernard read it slowly at his kitchen table, one finger tracking under each line, the way a man double-checks something he's afraid to believe is real. 9 years, Bernard said, setting the pages down. I stopped thinking anybody would ever come back and tell me it mattered. It mattered, Holden said. Cyrus wants your name on the subcommittee's founding letter if you're willing, not as an apology owed to you, as proof that somebody finally listened all the way through. Bernard didn't answer right away, just turned his damaged hand over once more, the old gesture, before nodding and reaching for a pen. Holden learned, weeks later and almost by accident, that the sorting floor crew had quietly passed a collection jar during his suspension, covering nearly a month of groceries he'd never asked anyone for and never would have, a fact nobody mentioned to him until Cyrus let it slip over coffee, embarrassed at having said anything at all. "We didn't do it because we felt sorry for you," Cyrus said, gruff about it. "We did it because you'd have done the same for any one of us, and everybody in that break room knew it without needing to discuss it." Holden tried to pay it back anyway, quietly, a few groceries here and there for anyone on the floor going through a rough stretch, and every time Cyrus caught him at it, he pretended not to notice, which both men understood was its own kind of agreement. Tessa went back to her Tuesday shift the following week, sorting floor, real badge, real paycheck, and made a point of clocking in 5 minutes early the first day back, standing at her station with her arms crossed until the new safety guard was inspected and bolted down in front of her, refusing to start the line until she'd checked it herself. "You don't have to do that every week," Holden told her, watching from the end of the line. "I know," she said. "I'm going to anyway." Tessa spent part of that summer's remaining week sitting in on Marla's office hours after her shifts, unpaid and uncredited, just watching how a contract clause got built line by line to close the exact kind of gap Landry had exploited, and told her father, almost offhand, that she was thinking about labor law once she finished school, not because of what had happened to her hand, she said, but because of what had happened afterward. The notebooks, the filings, the whole slow, unglamorous work of turning a wrong into something written down and enforceable. Holden didn't push her toward it or away from it. He just told her Marla's door was open any time she wanted to keep sitting in. The new contract was ratified for real 6 weeks later, in the same union hall, the same folding chairs, a very different room. Bernard Aldous came, seated near the front this time, instead of watching from home the way he'd told Holden he usually did on ratification nights, and Cyrus read the safety subcommittee's new inspection language aloud to the floor himself before the vote. 3 composition notebooks resting on the table in front of him like something finally allowed to rest. The measure passed with the widest margin the local had seen in years, no unfamiliar badges near the exits this time, just the people who actually belonged in the room. Marla closed her file on the case not long after, sliding the folder into the same wall of stacked cabinets where every other local's hard-won contract eventually came to rest, and told Holden on her way out the door that this was the part of the job she never got tired of. Watching a case that started as a threat end up as a permanent, boring, well-enforced clause nobody would ever have to fight over again. Holden kept the torn corner of company letterhead that had started all of it, the scrap that had fluttered out of Garrett Landry's folder onto the concrete of the sorting floor, tucked now into the same drawer where he kept Tessa's old badge photos and a stack of grievance filings going back 19 years. He didn't need it as proof of anything anymore. He kept it the way Cyrus kept his notebooks, as a reminder that the smallest overlooked piece of paper could, if somebody was paying attention, end up being the one that mattered most. He thought, standing at the end of the sorting line, about the folder that had fallen out of Garrett Landry's arms in the chaos of that first afternoon, a title and a date typed on company letterhead, proof that a man he'd trained and trusted had been quietly building an exit for years, while Holden kept fighting for a floor that Landry had already decided to sell. Tessa gave the last bolt one more turn anyway, out of pure habit now more than doubt, then straightened up, wiped her palms on her jeans, and waved him over. "Guard's good," she said. "Start the line."